I would like to speak about follows a lot from some of the earlier papers today, in particular on the question of the experiential and the question of kitsch, and on the question of how memorial museums mobilize nationalism. And in this project, I'm ultimately quite interested in expanding on and looking at architectures of conflict and protest and resistance, but today I'm really just going to focus on architecture as a kind of foreclosing of politics. So I'm interested in this question of the role of architecture and design in terms of physical, material, lived, built, designed, sometimes undesigned spaces that shape, dictate, and encourage particular kinds of human responses, emotions, practices. But also architecture as a kind of infrastructure that allows for certain kinds of discourses and frameworks for thinking. I ask the question, how does seeing remembrance through the framework of architecture allow us to make connections between contexts of remembrance and the context of violence, torture, and terrorism that have produced these politics of trauma and memory? Investigating the underlying assumptions about space and the built environment reveals how gender forms a primary element, unconsciously and consciously, in the structuring of space in ways that demand feminist analysis. And ultimately, the spaces that help shape the worlds of state terrorism, oppression, and resistance are built environments through which power is enacted and contested, and in which frameworks of gender are actively engaged. Now, I know there are many alternative architectures, and architecture can operate as a reparative form, but that's not what I'm discussing here today. So what does it mean for us to think of these spaces implicated together rather than in separate social realms? To think of the prison, just to note a highly gendered context, in the same context as the memorial, to think of the site of torture in relation to the museum, to think of the sites of protest in relation to sites of memory. One of the challenges to social change is resisting the kind of social compartmentalization that so seemingly naturally separates these realms. Perhaps I want to suggest, by looking at these different material and political spaces together, we can demand that discourses of memory not be seen in isolation or, as it is the case in the United States, within the framework of exceptionalism. This is one of the reasons why sites of memory and memory museums in the spaces of former detention and torture are so powerful, because of the way in which they intervene into the actual spaces of violence. There are many examples of this in South Africa, in Argentina, in Rwanda, and I would just note, because we were working with our Chilean colleagues, that in the Chilean context we have the Museo de la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos, which is a very modern building, and many memorial museums have embraced a very modern aesthetic, a topic that we could take up. Let's see, here's just a few pictures to give you a sense of the way in which memory is enacted within this framework of modern aesthetics there. And then we have the Estadio Nacional. So a question that lurks in this project is about the ways in which architectures, in which stadiums, right, sites designed for international sport, but also for crowd control, largely masculine spaces, have been so easily and readily transformed into sites of detention and torture in Chile, in Argentina, and in other sites. How are these spaces themselves conducive to this kind of transformation? So the very radical nature of the project to transform parts of this still functioning and largely unchanged Chilean National Stadium into sites of memory. And here you can see where a section of seats of the stadium from 1973 was separated out as a memorial. The radical nature of this project is underscored by the recent incident in which this small area of the stadium was vandalized. Here you can see our group there in September or December, and then here is where it was recently destroyed. So in what ways can we investigate the masculine project of architecture and unpack some of its codes? This is an image I used to talk about my concept of the tourism of history in the United States, the teddy bear and the soldier together. I'll limit my examples, mostly because of time, to the United States. The story of 9/11 is the story of many things, of global politics, nationalism, the politics of terrorism, of memory and loss, of revenge. It is also a story of architecture. The terrorists who targeted the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center did so because of the way that they read those buildings as architectural symbols, not only of global US-based capitalism and American empire, but also of masculine power. In the immediate aftermath of the destruction of the Twin Towers, calls were made by politicians and architects alike to rebuild the towers taller and bigger than before, testimony to the way that the loss of buildings was seen as emasculating. What we see in the post-9/11 context in the United States is still very much in a historical period that I would define as the post-9/11 context, is a culture of displacement and disavowal, a culture defined by what I referred to as a tourism of history, which I'm using as a kind of metaphor for the very distanced relationship that is enabled in US society around the US national relationship to global politics. And we see evidence of that a lot in things like memorial souvenirs and forms of reenactment. It is particularly important in a comparative context to note that unlike in Latin America, the discourse of memory in the United States has not at all been aligned with the project of human rights, and I think it would be important for us to think about why that is the case. Okay, so I want to talk just very briefly about the constellation of buildings that are rising in Lower Manhattan, and I think they have to be seen together, which is why I'm going to talk very briefly about each one. One World Trade Center. The building that most exemplifies the current state of the nation in post-9/11 US culture is One World Trade Center, formerly known as the Freedom Tower, still being constructed at Ground Zero in New York. It is exemplary of the most masculinist trends of modern architecture. Architecture and society is defined by security, as defense, as symbol, and as capital. An emblem of defensive architecture designed by David Childs of Skidmore, Owens, Merrill, with a concrete base 200 feet tall at a cost of approximately $38 billion. It is the most expensive building ever built. It is at the kitschy height of 1776 feet, a reference from initial architect Daniel Libeskind to the year of US independence. Currently the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, and that's only because they argued that that stupid spire on top counted as part of the building structure. The obscenity of this project's cost, and let's just think about that, $38 billion, a lot of which was public funding, and its defensive design is in concert with the banality of its corporate design. It is an empty symbol anchoring Lower Manhattan in ways that speak to the bankruptcy and dysfunctionality of post-9/11 US culture. There are a number of other towers being built there, some of which may never actually get that high because of financial problems, and there are several other buildings that being built at the site. Here's a couple of other views, including the much originally lauded train station by Santiago Calatrava, which, not surprising to any of you who might know his work, is now way over budget and way overdue. The 9/11 Memorial. The 9/11 Memorial, designed by Michael Arad, defines the space of Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan as one of absence. It's actually called Memorializing Absence, and in a constant replay of the events of 9/11. Its key design element are the two large footprints of the former towers. And to give him some credit, the designation of those as sacred spaces preceded his design, which now form two extremely large pools of cascading water. The pools of water are so immense that they overshadow all the other elements of the memorial. In many ways, the fetishizing of the footprints is revealing about how the processes of mourning function so often as sites of displacement. Scale, a key element in the masculinist project of modern architecture, is thus key to the failure of design at Ground Zero, the size of the pools aiming to replicate the size of the event. The footprints are so outsized that they make it practically impossible to have an experience of intimacy at the 9/11 Memorial. They dwarf the memorial's most important feature, which are the names that are on display around the pool's edges. Here's a picture of the designer. The 9/11 Memorial Museum. The 9/11 Memorial Museum opened in May 2014 and exemplifies the fraught relationship of design aesthetics to the experience of memory. The museum is a contested mix of narratives and positions, a project which, for varying political and bureaucratic reasons, a number of different architectural and design teams worked. The museum is not only a structure that aims to tell the narrative of 9/11, it is also an architectural framework that engages with the site itself as meaningful. This is the pavilion that was designed by Snøhetta, and you can see it looks almost Las Vegas at night, but most of the design is underground. The museum's design is threefold in its intent: to render the site of the former World Trade Center towers visible, to create spaces for an exhibition of objects and images that tell the story of 9/11, and to memorialize the almost 3,000 who died that day. It is inevitable that such site specificity raises issues of 9/11 exceptionalism. The architects of the museum building, Davis Brody Bond, designed the trajectory through the building as one that navigates a journey into the site itself. Visitors move from a lobby down a ramp that spatially takes them into the shock of the event, arriving at a landing, here's a picture of the landing, from which they can look out into the vast central space and its bedrock several stories below. Reminiscent of the many vista points that shapes the museum visitors' experience, this is one of familiar tourism. I could say much more. I'll just note that the politics of the museum have been so fraught that it is inevitably emblematic of a provincial and nationalistic framing of 9/11 rather than a global one. And a number of things happen there, such as parts of the steel appearing to be sort of aestheticized as works of art. There are many large objects within it. Sorry, I have to go through this quickly. This is the last column in the central space that was taken out of the site. So there's lots of kind of fetishizing of material objects within it. Quilts that were made around the country, objects on display. The actual exhibit itself is quite crowded, as you can see. And here's the memorial gallery. I will note one thing, and if we want to continue to talk about the experiential, that the most successful aspect of the museum is our audio recordings that were done with people who survived and who tell their stories in ways that are digitally sampled. The aspect of the museum that has received the most attention has inevitably been its gift shop, where an array of tacky and kitschy souvenirs are for sale, along with books and videos and educational items. Again, I could say a lot more, but I will just note, as I show you a few examples, water bottle, search and rescue dog, those are traveling cliche, hoodies. This was a headline from the New York Post, visit mass grave, buy a t-shirt. But this is an interesting aspect, I think, that they contracted a whole array of merchandise, as most museum stores do, with a kind of design feature. And the feature that they chose is the modern Gothic pattern of the original Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. So it's a very strange way in which the skyscraper aesthetic is memorialized and then merchandised. And I got this in an email after I went to the museum. So they're using this as part of their logo too, that kind of Gothic pattern. In the post-9/11 period, the building that truly haunts the structures at Ground Zero is the prison at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which, am I out of time? Okay, I'll talk quickly. Which remains a detention site as well as a site of torture. Guantanamo is a site of arrested time held in suspension since the legal stalemate between President Obama and Congress has effectively made it impossible to release the prisoners or close the prison. The architecture of Guantanamo, prison barracks, isolation chambers, heavily barricaded and fenced terrains, and also a deteriorating Cold War structure begins with its strange outer legal existence in Cuba, not in Cuba, within the US, not in the US, a site where US law can be bent and distorted. Its very existence, a deep manifestation of American empire and its renewal in the post-9/11 period. The post-9/11 culture of tolerance of torture in U.S. society in a nation that once identified itself as one that did not torture is paralleled by a culture of trivialization that often emerges in the form of kitsch. In the case of Guantanamo, this kitchification translates into the existence, I kid you not, of a gift shop at the military base at Guantanamo Bay, where the kitchification of torture implies a seamless integration into the activity of torture in the everydayness of domestic life. And this is a cartoon that was made by political cartoonist Matt Bors, in which he talks about someone being released from Guantanamo into the gift shop. Of course, to see Guantanamo and Ground Zero together would demand a discourse of human rights in relationship to memory in the United States. All right, I'm just going to finish now. The architecture of the post-9/11 era exemplifies aspects of the masculine project of modern architecture and forecloses many spaces, leaving out many possibilities of alternative architecture's design visions and hopes. The buildings participate in the nationalism and provincialism of the response to 9/11. They cannot register the loss of the many tens and hundreds of thousands who died in the wake of the 9/11 victims in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Pakistan, at Guantanamo, or to make connections between the trillions spent on the revenge of 9/11 that has now produced the pain of economic crisis in the United States. These, too, are consequences that emanate from Ground Zero. By seeing these spaces as interrelated and putting them into conversation with the spaces of protest and resistance, we can begin to open up spaces of memory into that of politics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Marianne Hirsch is William Peterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and Professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. She's the immediate past president of the Modern Language Association of America. Born in Romania, educated at Brown, she received her PhD degree there as well. Hirsch's work combines feminist theory with memory studies, particularly the transmission of memories of violence across generations. She is one of the founders of Columbia's Center for the Study of Social Difference and of its global initiative, Women Creating Change. So please.
Oh, so easy. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. 2014 is the year of monumental memory. Amidst the impressive commemorations of the start of the First World War, shocking new displays of nationalist and ethnic violence have created the occasion for massive mourning and, no doubt, future acts of commemoration. This summer was also bracketed by two important national museum openings, that of the National September 11th Memorial Museum in New York that Marita has already talked about last May, and in October, the opening of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. In their missions, both of these museums cite transformation as one of their goals. Museums have the capacity to be agents of transformation, said Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, the director of the permanent exhibit of the Warsaw Museum. You might wonder what kind of transformation. This monumentalized 21st century memory culture forms the backdrop to my talk, which reflects not on memory's locations in national histories and fixed urban spaces, but on the topic of our workshop, memory's mobility. How, I would like to ask, can memory be mobile? How can it be mobilized for a transcultural future that resists nationalist ideologies and monumentalities and their erasures of difference? What conditions enable memory's mobility? Judith Butler has recently explained that our mobility as social subjects depends on support and material conditions, on architecture and infrastructure. In the course and in the aftermath of genocide, war, political repression, and massive individual and communal losses, these conditions are necessarily compromised, And that compromise creates the need for compensatory gestures like these giant memorial institutions. I would like to explore alternative responses outside and beyond these grand reactive gestures. What Eve Sedgwick called middle ranges of agency that can, in her words, offer space for effectual creativity and change. I want to focus specifically on the role of aesthetic practices in the activation and dissemination of memory, and to highlight small, unofficial, anti-monumental, and indeed critical memory practices that enabled what Mike Ball has called little resistances. Contemporary artists have used a variety of media to devise anti-monumental migratory memory strategies that might affect such little resistances. Resistances to hegemonic nationalist and ethnocentric idioms of memory, resistances to easy forms of consumption and empathy, resistances to repeating or reinscribing the structures that are responsible for the violence being recalled, and resistances to activating feelings of vulnerability in the interests of exclusionary protection and denial, and we've just heard about that with the 9/11 Museum. There are, of course, many possible examples of such practices, and you see a number of them in the Women Witnessing exhibit that surrounds us. In my brief time today, I want to look briefly at two artists who can help us think about a vulnerable and mobile, non-hegemonic and extraterritorial aesthetics and politics of memory. Silvina Dermegedician and Mirta Kupfermink. And both are, coincidentally, both are daughters and granddaughters of refugees from 20th century genocides, the Armenian and the Holocaust. But coincidentally, both were born in exile in Argentina, the site of further state violence and repression. Mirta Kupfermink's 2001 black and white etching, En Camino, illustrates the difficult conditions of mobility. Here we have 7 figures attempting to move from left to right, but they are immobilized, pulled backward, hunched over under the weight of the objects they carry, not just uprooted trees, but houses, household objects, entire villages. What is more, these figures seem to float on different planes. There's no solid ground, no support under their feet. In Kupfermink's iconography of Jewish exile, uprooted trees signify expulsion from home and a violent break in continuity, genealogy, and generation. In absorbing nourishment from the soil, trees contain the knowledge of the past, and they carry that knowledge into the future. But if they're uprooted for too long, they will die, obliterating generations of history and memory. In the etching, and especially in a 2005 animated version of En Camino, humans blend into the trees, themselves becoming embodied archives of past knowledge that they attempt with difficulty to carry forward. And I'm going to show you just a couple of minutes of the animated version of this etching. The animation enables their mobility without diminishing the weighty burden of memory that they continue to hold. Carrying suitcases, bags, trees, these figures walk, run, and climb. They float and are blown around on multiple non-intersecting planes, forward, backward, and sideways. You can't see it in this little clip, but they morph into hybrid mythic creatures, metamorphose into Hebrew letters. They float into and out of books and pages. They walk up and down a ruler. They emerge from a coat pocket. Letters multiply. Torahs walk forward and back. The humor, incongruity, and playfulness lighten the burden of painful pasts without diminishing it. These characters seem trapped in the pages and the repeated gestures of an ancient Jewish scenario of expulsion and exile, a story that is written about, for, and against them. But as the letters float around on the screen, as though the doodles of a child, we're also invited to imagine different scenarios with different beginnings and endings. The artist grants her characters the shapes of letters that can be arranged and maybe rearranged, thus mobilizing multiple potential histories on the threshold of more open-ended futures. These recursive trajectories complicate, or we might say queer, a genealogical temporality of loss and attempted recovery. This is an evocative aesthetics of small gestures in miniature. Its circuits of mythic memory bypass homogeneous cultural or national traditions and heteronormative genealogies in favor of diasporic networks that could be reimagined and reconfigured. I'd sort of like to get the slides back now. Sorry I can't show you the whole video. These are qualities. Okay. These are qualities that Mirta Kupferming's work shares with Silvina Demirgelicyan. Though they use different media and evoke different histories of loss, both artists open memory to the future. Luckily, there's no need here to introduce Silvina's beautiful carpet series, an example of which is hanging in the room. But here, this carpet is installed in a city from which the subjects of the images that compose it were violently evicted. But I would venture to say that this is less a gesture of restoration than of connection and potentiality. The patterns, loosely stitched together, seem provisional. They can and have been remade. They could be remade many times over. In the carpet series, memory has texture. As hybrid products of photography and handicraft, the carpets are doubly indexical. Touch marks every part of the work. The photographs themselves bear the marks of having been passed from hand to hand, looked at, refolded, and scratched. The crochet contains the mark of the artisan's hand and invites touch, and the quilt itself moves in relation to the visitor's movement and touch. For Eve Sedgwick, texture and touch reside precisely in the middle ranges of agency that can provoke change. She says, to touch is always to understand other people and natural forces as having effectually done so before oneself. In Silvina's Retocada, Retouched, the texture of memory is reduced to threads of red wool evoking the blood of genocidal murder. As the artist explains in an interview, she aims to restore not just presence, but also absence to Armenian stories that have lost the red thread that would give them direction. With a view to restitching collective group memories, and even while preserving the break, she limits herself to giving us the bare thread, and with it, potential stories. The textures of a disappearance that, retouched, opens to possible transformations and alternative futures. Memorial museums, as we've just been hearing, especially if they're built on sites of destruction, take up space, monumentalize memory, to claim or to reclaim certain narratives in the present. The deterritorialized memorial practices I've been highlighting here also engage in acts of repair, but these are small acts that do not aim at restitution. If they rebuild, they take up small virtual spaces. In providing the media and the support that bodies need in order to move forward, and in fostering a receptive responsiveness through fantasy, play, and touch, these artists resist the monumentality that memory has acquired in our eventful present, a monumentality that has been holding us back, I would venture to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, indeed. Well, I'd like to thank Marianne Hirsch for bringing these beautiful works of art to our attention and making her incisive, perceptive analysis on them to show us how mobile memories can be acts of resistance to violence and violent acts. Okay, now we'll have Nükhet Sirman's presentation. And Nükhet Sirman is a professor of anthropology at Boğaziçi University. Her publications include articles on women in agricultural production, production of the modern Turkish women in Turkey, notions of honor and kinship, gender, nationalism, life stories, violence against women, forced migration are some of the issues she's been working on. and she has been active in various feminist groups in Istanbul, published articles in feminist journals such as Amargi, Feminist, Politika, and Feminist Yaklaşımlar. And since 2009, she's been working on the genderization of war and peace within Women's Initiative for Peace. Yes, Nükhet.
Well, first of all, the mic. Thanks a lot for being here. Işığı kapatmamıza da gerek yok aslında. We don't need to turn off the lights, actually. My talk is entitled Gendering Memories of Violence, and I have a subtitle, Gendering the 90s. We are a group of women who call themselves the Women's Initiative for Peace. We are linked to about 500 women through the internet, but our number varies according to the work we do at any specific moment. We come from different walks of life, although the majority are in their late 20s and in their 30s, but as you can see, I'm also here, our age range is also wide, and so are the various political positions that we hold dear. What brings us together is our dedication to establish peace, primarily between the Turkish state and the Kurdish Workers' Party, especially now, as of January 2013, that the Turkish government has declared its willingness, and I use that with a lot of trepidation, to end the conflict, because nothing is clear. The worst part of the Kurdish conflict took place in what is called in everyday language the 90s. This is a period during which atrocities were committed against the largely peasant population of Kurdistan, of the Kurdish regions, with about 50,000 dead, mostly Kurds, civilians as well as guerrillas, 4,000 villages emptied of its inhabitants by the armed forces, 1.2 million people forced to migrate, 5,000 civilians having died violent deaths, including death in custody, disappearances, summary executions, murders by unknown perpetrators, according to official figures. And between 1997 and 2012, 363 women having reported rape and sexual harassment under custody, 264 of whom are Kurdish. These atrocities are largely unknown by the public at large in the rest of Turkey, and the state considers them normal casualties sustained in the course of a rebellion against a legitimately elected government. The result is that many of the crimes committed against civilians are never prosecuted, never brought to court. We, the Women's Initiative for Peace, have, to use Shoshana Feldman's term, appointed ourselves to bear witness to the atrocities of the 90s. Above all, we have appointed ourselves to bear witness to the gendered nature of the atrocities of the 90s. We do this in the hope that peace negotiations that are now underway will include women as victims, as actors, and as negotiators during peace talks, and that on the basis of the experience of the 90s, a new gender regime can be negotiated. We use optimism as a strategy. Feldman describes the witness appointee as a strange appointment from which the witness appointee cannot relieve himself by any delegation, substitution, or representation, end of quote. We cannot delegate this appointment because we feel that if we do, something about the truth of what it is we appoint ourselves to witness will go missing. That is the gendered nature of war. Thus, we appoint ourselves to stand witness for the gendered nature of war, to stand for a truth about war and about the 90s that no one else is willing or able to deal with, and therefore, to quote again, and it's always Feldman, to bear the solitude of a responsibility and to bear the responsibility of that solitude, end of quote. And yet, we are not all first-hand witnesses of the 90s. Some of us are, And the rest, those of us who are of age, also sort of are, since we do remember the awful refrain in the news during the 90s. In X province, 5 terrorists have been apprehended dead, ölü olarak ele geçirildi. But we are mostly witnesses of witnesses, having read witnesses' testimonies, newspaper reports, memories of army personnel who served in the Kurdish regions during the 90s, proceedings of trials, very few and far between, where such persons were testifying for crimes committed in other places, in other wars, parliamentary reports, as well as research done by other civilian investigators, such as the Memory and Justice Project. All of these testimonies, to quote Feldman yet again, quote, do not offer a completed statement, a totalizable account of those events, end of quote. Because, as she explains, quote, testimony seems to be composed of bits and pieces of a memory that has been overwhelmed by occurrences that have not settled into understanding or remembrance. Acts that cannot be construed as knowledge, nor assimilated into full cognition. Events in excess of our frames of reference. End of quote. This inability of testimonies to offer a completed statement leads, according to Feldman, to what she calls a crisis of truth, because in this era of horror and violence, we face a history that is in its immediacy a crisis, whose truth cannot be easily accessed. And yet we, in the Women's Initiative for Peace, not having learned the numerous lessons from South Africa, Peru, Guatemala, and all the rest of it, and have established a truth commission and have done all the research mentioned above, collecting, classifying, and poring over the data. We work with a simple Excel chart that has 10 columns and, unfortunately, 456 rows. The rows show the number of events we have encountered during 1 month, and I'm running them now. Unfortunately, these are in Turkish. The whole thing lasts an hour and 15 minutes, but you will not get the whole thing. And unfortunately, it's in Turkish. The rows show the number of events we have encountered during 1 month, December 1993. So you have 460, what did I say, 56 rows for 31 days. Okay? We decided to try and recuperate the events of just 1 month of the decade called the 90s. We zoom in on 1 month, which, according to diverse sources, was crucial in changing the course of the way the dirty war, sometimes it's also called the dirty war, was waged. We note in each row what we encounter in the documents we consult, and we put these next to the main headings of newspapers during the 31 days that are our object of study. We do this because we have read innumerable testimonies of war over a period of 5 months. We have read them over a period of 5 months. These are mostly women's testimonies. I quote, and it's not even a quote, and you can see many of those upstairs in the Raising the Photograph by the Memory and Justice Project. The soldiers, came into our village early one morning and told us to get out of the house, took my older brother away, and set fire to all the houses in the village. This is a testimony from Malan Barkır'ın, Houses Moved, my translation badly. We heard one testimony in Lice ourselves last summer after a 19-year-old youth was killed by army bullets in June 2013. Quote, they never left us in peace. We were asked to take their New Year's turkey up to the army outpost. They would come in and ask who our guests were. They would untie our goats, and we could not even go look after them. And once they beat my husband badly, end of quote. These words speak of the continued pain and suffering undergone by the rural Kurdish population during the 90s, but do not add up to a, quote, totalizable account of those events. let alone a gendered account of those events. Obviously, Feldman talks about testimony as a testimony to many layered truths, testimony to the truth of the unconscious, to an unconscious testimony, to the accident of poetry, to a theory of psychoanalysis, which he says is nothing other than a finally available statement, and in the end, to the violence of language. Popular language calls all these testimonies the testimony of the 90s, an enigmatic phrase which is meant to provide a totalized account of those events. The Kurdish political movement has a different statement or account to offer: denial and eradication of ethnic difference. What Feldman calls the crisis of truth in testimony is surely not overcome by those statements. In effect, Feldman speaks of a crisis of truth in testimony that cannot be overcome, since it is language itself that lies at the root of that crisis. For example, this is an event on the 12th we're still on the first day of December. The place is Batman. In a particular neighborhood, a man called Talip Topsuz died. And we have also the sources, etc. So this is the 2nd of December now. And yet, we still do not learn our lessons, and do not learn this particular lesson either. And we try to provide a gendered statement about these testimonies through a reading of recordings of those events. We take the numerous sources we use, testimonies that have been written down by others, newspaper reports, memories of soldiers, reports of various civil society organizations such as the Human Rights Foundation, and reports of parliamentary committees as records and testimonies that need to be deciphered. As a result, we have come up with different levels of truth that need to be looked into. The truth of the victim, the truth of the perpetrator, like the Korucu that Shemsa mentioned a little during the discussion session of the first session. The truth of women, the truth of the state, and the truth of the west of Turkey. Women have always been targets in war. There are numerous accounts that testify to this truth. Women have been raped, bereaved, forcefully displaced, estranged, and degraded. They have also learned to resist, to organize and fight, and this especially among Kurdish women. All of the events of December 1993 need to be analyzed together if we want to say something about the gender truth about this war. So there might be general truths about women, but we want the truth about this war, about the 90s. When did women get raped? By whom? Where? With a view to what? How did they respond? When? Where? When did women resist? When and where? And what happened when they resisted? If women's bodies are battlefields, and here I take over a term used by Hito Steyerl, very difficult for me to pronounce this, in a lecture called Is the Museum a Battlefield? Hito Steyerl describes a battlefield in Van where her childhood friend Andrea Wolf died as a PKK fighter in combat with the Turkish army, and after she died, her body was mutilated. So if women's bodies are battlefields, we want to see how this battle was fought, taking all sides of the battle into account. Will all this amount to a final statement about the gender truth of this war? Tant pis if they don't, as the French say, or olsun. Let it not, but what we remember is that we are compelled, appointed by ourselves, to bear witness to the gendered atrocities of the 90s. Thank you.
Thank you, Nükhet, for sharing with us the work of Women's Initiative for Peace and the important questions raised by them. We will move on to Meltem Ahıska's presentation now. And Meltem Ahıska will talk about, will tell us, deliver her talk or her presentation on the Saturday Mothers of Turkey. Meltem Ahıska is professor of sociology at Boğaziçi University. She has written and edited a number of books, among which Occidentalism in Turkey, Questions of Modernity and National Identity in Turkish Radio Broadcasting is the most recent, 2010. Her articles and essays on Occidentalism, social memory, national identity, and gender have appeared in various journals and edited volumes. She has been in the editorial collectives of Akıntıya Karşı, Zemin, Defter, Pazartesi journals, and she's a member of the editorial board of the e-journal Red Thread. Meltem.
Thank you very much. Why can't we have the photos? Okay. Okay, the presentation I'm going to make today is based on a forthcoming article in a volume edited by two Argentine scholars, Estola Schindel and Pamela Colombo, entitled Space and the Memories of Violence. But given the strict time limitations, it's not possible to cover all my arguments here. Instead, I will dwell on a few points that I find significant for discussion. Primarily, I suggest to rethink the relation between space, time, state violence, and memory in the particular case of the Saturday Mothers movement in Turkey. Saturday Mothers are the mothers of the disappeared in Turkey who have been silently demonstrating by upholding the photographs of their disappeared kin every Saturday in Galatasaray, Istanbul, since 1995. Last Saturday, they had their 494th weekly meeting. The Saturday Mothers have not attracted much attention, much scholarly attention, either in Turkey or elsewhere, while, for example, the Argentine, Chilean, and Guatemalan mothers of the disappeared are more visible. I have known about the demonstrations of the Saturday Mothers for a long time, had participated in some of them for solidarity and even written some essays on them. Yet I had not realized until very recently that the particular space where the mothers demonstrated was actually created by a movement that goes counter to the force of hegemonic time. This sense awareness, which is very different from common sense perception, was triggered by the Gezi resistance last year. What I find most significant in the upheavals that took place during May-June 2013 for the concerns of this presentation is the political portability of place, as it were, expressed in the widely employed slogan, "Everywhere is Taksim, everywhere is resistance." Here we see not an attempt to unify the space by claiming Taksim to be the center, but just the contrary, to deconstruct the central monumental space of Taksim as a space of government and commerce, and to proliferate the impact of resistance by moving the newly created political space of resistance to other places. And this was possible by opening Taksim to differential temporalities, by moving beyond the hegemonic construction of space and time in capitalist national politics. For example, the resistance rendered visible the now absent presence of an Armenian cemetery in the surroundings of Gezi Park and connected this repressed history of destruction in the 1930s to present political concerns. I argue that it is this new contemporaneity that allowed for a counter-movement of space, and it is within this new light that I revisit the politics of Saturday Mothers. We know that in the homogenized temporality of the nation, the movement of people, objects, and land enables the accumulation of capital and enables government. In this movement named progress, the scope and rapidity of change has caused an immense disjunction, producing a particular violence of displacement and loss disguised as modern development. The enforced disappearances are also related to the displacement of people for the sake of sustaining a particular power regime. Avery Gordon's reflection on disappearances in Argentina in the late 1970s is thought-provoking in this respect. Quote, "Disappearance is a complex system of repression, a thing in itself, with less noise than expected, it removes people from their familiar world with all its small joys and pains and transports them to an unfamiliar place where certain principles of social reality are absent. End of quote. A female member of the Agrupación, groups of relatives of the disappeared in Chile, puts it so poignantly, quote, "But suddenly, as though taken by the wind, they disappeared. They were pulled from their houses, from work, from the university." End of quote. And as a mother of a disappeared from Turkey recognizes, the removal has been rightly associated with the moving force of the state. Quote, "It was the state. No one could stand against the state." End of quote. A description that reminds one of an irresistible storm. Then the politics against disappearance, for example, in the case of the mothers of the disappeared, can be revisited by thinking about the desire to retransport the disappeared onto another space, the counter-movement of space, to give them a second life while making loss visible and political. Enforced disappearance is more than an individual targeted act. It aims to eradicate a certain community of people, their movement and life networks. The cases of enforced disappearances in Turkey mostly belong to the period after the 1980 military coup, although as a violent strategy of the state, it was used much earlier, especially during the Armenian genocide in 1915. Yet 1980 constitutes a significant rupture during which earlier strategies of the state were selectively appropriated, condensed, and re-implemented. However, the neoliberal social and economic context created a double reality during the 80s, with dissidents and opposition repressed through violent means on one side, and a fast-growing middle class enjoying the opportunities of the new regime on the other. The divide was also more or less a geographical one between the east and west of the country. Enforced disappearances mostly happened in Kurdistan, where a state of emergency and martial law was declared against the resisting Kurdish people, fabricating an exceptional zone. The enforced disappearances reached the highest numbers in the 1990s, as Nükhet was talking about, with the advent of the war in the Kurdish regions of the country. The reported number of disappearances amounts to between 1,000 to 2,000, yet the lists prepared by human rights organizations are tentative, as there are no official records available. Through the extra-legal networks of the regional government, the state enacts a privatized system of violence in the exceptional zones. This has seemingly contradictory yet interdependent consequences. One is embedding the practices of violence in the space and making it familiar to the inhabitants, and the second is creating anonymity in the wider realm of law and so-called democracy. The Turkish armed forces, reconstructed for the purposes of what they called low-intensity warfare in Kurdistan, created and manipulated a network of personalized alliances to enforce their matter-of-fact law. For example, turning some villagers into village guards against the guerrillas. The villagers who refused to cooperate with the state were forced to migrate, their villages were burnt down, many were killed or disappeared. The embedding of violence in the space transformed the lived space into one of death and destruction. The desperate families in search of their disappeared kin first sought help from the local authorities, from the prosecutors, the gendarmerie, and the village guards, with a faint hope that the authorities, who were in fact the perpetrators, would help. However, each time they were confronted with lies, denial, or open threats. A very striking example comes from a woman in search of her disappeared husband. Quote, "We did not know what to do. We waited, and eventually we went to the prosecutor's office and said, 'We have a complaint, we have a problem.' And the prosecutor told us, 'Go back to your homes.' He then added, 'The whole world is like this.' And he did not let us do anything. The space embedded with violence appears timeless under its subjection to the hegemonic movement of progress and dislocated from history and memory. The weekly silent demonstrations of the Saturday Mothers in Galatasaray, not more than 30 people at that time, holding the photographs of their disappeared relatives and demanding that those missing under custody be found and those responsible be tried, were initiated in 1995 and had to stop in 1999 due to severe police attacks, only to resume in 2009. Most Saturday mothers are from families forced to migrate to Istanbul in the early 90s. Most did not have any particular experience in active politics. While women's memory is usually associated with domestic space, these women had to leave their home, mobilizing their memories against the pernicious storm of state violence. I would say the gendered aspects of this counter movement require further thinking, which I'm not going to go in now. There was a certain, but say few things maybe, there was a certain disidentification with their predetermined gender roles and spaces, which allowed the making of time for politics. The created space for politics, which overlaps a given public space fused with many symbols of imperiality, government, entertainment, and consumption in Galatasaray at the center of Istanbul, is only temporary. However, the temporality that is constructed by the rhythm of the movement, of the counter movement, meeting every Saturday in the same place at noon for 17 years now, creates a new space opened up by time made by politics. In that particular space, they permit, as Cathy Caruth would say, history to arise where immediate understanding may not. They expand the passing time to transform the given space and infuse it with the memories of loss. Upholding the photographs as evidence of both life and loss, they seem to silently ask, as Judith Butler says, "Who am I without you? On one level, I think I have lost you, only to discover that I have gone missing as well." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before I left home, I came up with a title for the Armenian heritage trip to Turkey. I was going to call it 20 Armenians on a Bus, or the 30 Handkerchief Tour. Our guide calls it a pilgrimage and refers to us as pilgrims as though we are on a religious or spiritual quest. What do I hope to find? Almost 100 years have passed since my grandmother and her family were driven from their home in Mersin in 1915. Only my grandmother and her brother survived the death march. They were among thousands of Armenian orphans in a camp in the desert at Ras Al-Ain. Remnants, Everek Develi. The St. Toros Church in Everek is now a mosque. There is a fresco on the wall between the left and central apses near the altar. When our guide had last visited, there was a movable plywood board over the fresco. The painting was whitewashed many times, but the portrait of the Virgin bled through again and again. Now the plywood panel is screwed into place so it cannot be moved. The mayor of the town arrives at the mosque while we are there. He asks if we have any information about the church because they know nothing of its history. Remnants. That word floats up in my mind as we leave the mosque and walk towards the home of the last Armenian in Everek. He died in 2000 and left the property to his nephew in Istanbul. We peer in the windows at the dusty rooms of a once grand house in the old Armenian quarter. These buildings are remnants, and we are remnants, like scraps of fabric from a torn curtain. We are searching for ghosts, and we ourselves are ghosts, come to haunt this land. House, Gumush Hajikay. The last Armenians in this town are an elderly sister and brother named Haganush and Kegram. Their ramshackle wood frame and plaster house features an inner courtyard that is jammed with logs, pots, broken furniture, cats, stacks of newspaper, fragments of stone with Armenian inscriptions, and balled-up plastic bags. Haganush says, "My house is a mess, but my soul is orderly." The rest of their family lives in Istanbul in Germany, but they stay here as guardians of this property, the crumbling house with its jumbled courtyard, a large walled garden next door with fruit trees, vegetable beds, chickens, more cats, and piles of matted wool. They lead us to the local grade school. The brother says it had originally been an Armenian school, and the parking lot next to it is where the Armenian church once stood. A local official who disliked Armenians had ordered the demolition of the church. When the town held the groundbreaking for a mosque to be erected on the same spot, an earthquake hit and a stone fell on the official and he died. Or maybe Kegam said a lightning bolt hit him. He can't remember which. In any event, the man was killed and the mosque was never built. Flowers, Mersin. My grandmother always said, we came from near Tarsus. You know St. Paul of Tarsus? I was born in Mersin and your grandfather in Adana. It wasn't until after my grandmother died that I even bothered to try to find them on a map. As we drive south through the Taurus Mountains, we start seeing signs for Mersin, Tarsus, and Adana. The landscape changes dramatically. There are pine trees along the roads, which give way to orchards, and then we begin to see pink oleander and tall thistles. Our guide has warned me that there are no traces at all in Mersin of the Armenians who once lived there. Everything is gone. When we arrive in Mersin, we drive to the marina where there are boats docked, and beyond them, the Mediterranean Sea. My grandmother saw these skies and walked along this very shore. She loved the flowers in her New England garden, and how much she must have loved the ones here: pink and white oleander, lantana, bougainvillea, and red hibiscus. Bridge, Adana. We go to the old Armenian quarter of Adana, where the main market street has recently undergone a renovation, replacing its rundown charm, still evident in the side streets, with a gentrified sameness. We walk to the Great Clock Tower, which was designed in the late 19th century by two Armenian architects, but it is now shrouded for renovation. Our guide tells us that it was at this tower that Turkish crowds were incited to murder Armenians during the Adana massacres of 1909, when over 2,000 Armenians were killed in the city. My grandfather left for America in 1911. None of the Armenian churches and schools of Adana is still standing. This is another place where we have been erased, a word that one of the women on the bus keeps using: erased, effaced, rubbed out. We go to the stone bridge, which dates to Roman times, over the Ceyhan River. My grandfather died when I was 3, so I have few memories of him, but I imagine the young man from a faded photo. He is wearing a charcoal suit, and his mustache has just been trimmed. He strides across the bridge, a folded newspaper under his arm. Chandelier, Mezire Alazik. One of the men on the bus, Nükhet Sirman, tells us his family story as we drive towards Mezire. Nükhet's great-grandfather Kricor, with the surname İpekcan, İpek meaning silk in Turkish, had founded a textile factory in Mezire in the 19th century. The silk produced by İpekcan was so fine that it attracted international acclaim, and in recognition of this renown, the Sultan changed the family name to Fabrikatorian. Kricor Fabrikatorian had 5 sons who took over the company after his death in 1902, and they expanded its operations to 2 large factories. The 5 brothers built 5 townhouses side by side. In 1915, the 5 brothers were shot on the outskirts of town. Their wives and children were deported. One of the children was Nükhet Fabrikatorian's father, who was among the few family members to survive. The townhouses had been pulled down and replaced by apartment buildings in the 50s, but the name, the 5 Brothers, had been retained. We walk down the hot, crowded street, all 20 of us following Nükhet and our guide, until we find the signs, the 5 Brothers Apartments and the 5 Brothers Passageway. On the ground floor of one of the buildings, we enter an internet cafe whose owner tells us he was born in one of the houses. He shows us an old photo of them hanging on the wall. He tells us to go next door to his brother's pharmacy to see more pictures. We find there also, hung somewhat incongruously and off-center in the shop, a brass chandelier salvaged from one of the townhouses. Nükhet's son asked the pharmacist if they might purchase the chandelier. He replies, I wouldn't sell it to you even if you offered me $1 million. Prayer, Akhtamar. We start the morning, which happens to be the first day of Ramadan, with a ferry ride to Akhtamar Island on Lake Van. It is breezy on the blue lake and not too hot on the island. The 10th century Armenian Cathedral of the Holy Cross is beautifully preserved, as are the bas-reliefs on its exterior. Inside the church, there are frescoes depicting the life of Christ, sections of them still in good condition. The church is now a state museum. And when people in our group start singing the Hayr Mer prayer, a Turkish guard approaches, saying that singing is forbidden. We are the sole visitors in the museum, a museum that has a cross on its roof and an ornate altar. Adi explains that we are singing a universal song for peace. Then someone starts the Dervagormia prayer, while the guard motions with his hand to keep the volume down. The voices rise, and he rakes his thumb across his throat, telling us to kill the music. The Armenians keep singing, Lord have mercy, all holy Trinity, give peace to the world and healing to the sick and heaven to those who are asleep. With the music echoing after me, I leave the church to sit outside behind a tall metal candle stand, weeping. As a very much lapsed Armenian evangelical, I think of religion as a tool of oppression. But here a prayer has for a moment transformed this so-called museum that is a state-controlled space concerned as much with forgetting as remembering into something radically incarnate. Here, where Armenian churches have been razed, ruined, turned into barns, made into prisons, wedding halls, cultural centers, mosques, and museums, we sing this prayer as an act of pure resistance. Lord have mercy, all holy Trinity, give peace to the world and healing to the sick and heaven to those who are asleep.
Thank you, Nancy. Okay. Do I see hands? Hand? Perhaps just exactly. Absolutely. It was the last. Yeah, it was such a moving, and I was curious. Oh, okay. I could. Yeah.
One of the things that seems so interesting to me about
Thank you. So one of the things, first of all, thank you for this wonderful panel. One of the things that seemed to me so interesting was all the different ways of thinking about space. And from the monumental to the lost to the mobile stitching, kind of pulling things together, to this way in which space becomes statistics and documents, and the way you're mapping it in this other kind of a way, in the way of the Saturday Mothers. And so I just wondered if at some point we could just bring up the idea of what is the political potential or promise of this mobility. Is it something in the mobility itself that's the potential, the political potential? That was just my question.
I wanted to, in a sense, follow up on the question of space and ask specifically to Meltem about the Saturday Mothers. And that space, as you pointed out, when that protest was first initiated, it was rather violently put down by police. But in 2009, it began to be tolerated over time. So I guess what I'm wondering, we were there last year when there was a lot of police presence everywhere. But suddenly on a Saturday morning when this protest took place, police disappeared. And so I'm wondering about spaces that sometimes are actually tolerated by authorities for some particular reason. That is, the politics of space as a kind of space of where hegemony allows a certain protest to take place in order to, in a sense, diminish it. So that's...
This is just, I haven't quite thought this through yet, but I've noticed an opposition today between sort of individual experience and then like sort of massive, faceless, monumental objects. And one of the things that sort of distinguishes between those two things is, well, on the one hand, a small individual can feel extremely helpless in the face of those objects. On the other hand, the thing that small individuals have is that sort of unites them is the access to the kinds of affect you were describing in different ways. When Marianne was talking about humor and playfulness and things like, or when Nancy was recounting the experience of being on these tours. So I'm wondering, I guess, about the political effect of different kinds of affect, which Marita, when you were talking about kitsch, I was thinking about that as another way of casting humor and playfulness. So if you could say more about that.
Responding to the questions.
Okay. This one. Okay. About mobility as a potential, maybe I can say a few words. I'm thinking, I'm not thinking of praising mobility, because mobility, what I have tried to argue as counter-movement, there's already mobility as a modality of power, like in the accumulation of capital, as I said, in the enforced migrations and all that. There's this mobility, this regulated time that is very oppressive, that is very leads to exploitation, oppression, etc. So how you resist that mobility by a counter movement? That was my argument. That's my problematic, and I've thought about it as a counter movement because all in those exceptional zones, the violence was really embedded, and most of the people in Istanbul would not know about that. Whereas the people, the Kurds in Kurdistan, would think that it's part of everyday life. It's like the whole world is like this, the prosecutor was telling them. So this kind of taking this kind of resistance, affects, loss, moving them to creating another space was very important for the politics. And time here is another concept of time, another conception of time is very critical, I think, in this politics. Is the space of Saturday Mothers tolerated? I'm not sure. Because they were really severely attacked and they had really to fight with the police, and during these fights, they were really transformed as political actors, actresses, because they learned how to shout and, they were taken under custody and all kinds of things. But now I think it's, especially after the Gezi events, and especially with the maybe so-called negotiations, the consequences or the results of which we're not sure yet, there's this maybe only temporary kind of not touching them for a while. We don't know what happens next year, what happens. But the thing, this insistence, this persistence, this temporality that is created by this persistence, going there every week at noon, I think creates a very important space and a different concept of time for politics. That was my point.
And it has become even more contested, hasn't it? After Gezi, I mean, because everybody who has a stake with government moves in that side, and now there's even more policemen in Galatasaray. That wasn't the case before in the 90s, perhaps. So anyway.
Is this sort of is an Excel chart mobile? I don't know. Or I mean, this moving names and events was created for a conference, not for this one, that we held in a conference for Women for Peace. As to show the kind of stuff that the Truth Commission of Women for Peace was doing. See, so it's not.
I just want to clarify one thing, that I stated my question wrong, badly in respect to yours, because I just want to clarify because. Thank you. Because what I meant is you have transformed yourselves into witnesses. Mm-hmm. And from whatever space you are at, you are creating a space of witness. Mm-hmm. And it's a mobile space because it's digital, it's this, it's that. You don't all have to be concretely in that space at that time. So that's the way I meant it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is obvious. Obviously, I mean, one interesting thing is that I've done research, anthropological research. I'm an anthropologist by training in Mersin. And when I was hearing Nancy's and her grandmother about Mersin, I also remembered or realized that I also was a witness to the last two Armenians of Mersin as well. So yes, our bodies, our travels, our lives do become, we are mobile memory sites in many ways. But I'm much more interested in what an Excel chart, a very simple and stupid Excel chart, is able to accomplish. And you see the entries on the rows, the columns just state, what happened, where, when, which one of us found it, where did they find it, do we have a story about what goes on before, do we have a story about what went on afterwards? That's it, that's the 10 columns, that's all. But what we're interested in is to see how the rows become mobile. In other words, if we're talking about mobility, how do the rows speak to one another? For example, we've discovered that there was a turning point in 1993, December 1993. There was a Security Council meeting and things began to change afterwards. We could see the newspaper headings changing. We could see, that there were emptying of villages, very few of them before December 1993, but after 1993, these increased very much. The raping and abuse, the physical abuse of women don't exist before December 1993. So there's a question of when, where, why, and how, which can be read from a very simple and stupid Excel document. That's what I wanted to convey.
Well, I would say that Excel document becomes moving and meaningful because of your presence in this room. I think what you're doing is you're animating it for us. You're bringing it to life. You're making us care about those facts because of your witnessing of these people, your curiosity, your desire to understand the historical specificity of these crimes and of these individual lives. Otherwise, it would just be an Excel chart. And I think that the same is true for spaces. How we move in space, I think mobility is also the purview of power, and we've just said that, and it comes out of the Judith Butler sense that what we need to be mobile is to have certain conditions and infrastructure and architecture and the possibility to move. And without that, we're those floating figures who don't have a ground under our feet. But at the same time, I don't want to say that mobility is the only way to have a political effect, because we see the political effect of stasis, of standing and waiting, of standing in Regina Galindo's work, of the standing man in Taksim, the standing figure. So I think mobility is not the only way to chart that. So I think one of the things that's happened here today for me is to see some of the power and some of the limitations of comparative work. I think that my paper was meant to address the nationalist impulses in memory work and these museums that take up space in certain ways to foster and to support a nationalist, ethnocentric enterprise. Those spaces speak to each other, but they mean very different things in different contexts. So the absences that Nancy spoke about have a different valence, and there you might think, well, reclaiming space, reclaiming that museum, turning it back into a church might, and that might be a nationalistically motivated gesture, and yet at a certain moment that might be really important. So we have different temporalities and different histories speaking to each other in different moments. I want to just come back quickly to Andrea's question about affect, which I think we shouldn't actually put aside. So I don't want to take up too much time right here, but I think I wanted to bring play and humor into the conversation about, in a day when we're talking about gendered memory of horrific violence. Because how can we respond to the absences that Nancy finds, or to the horrific stories that the Saturday Mothers can tell, or the fact those lines on the chart can tell? We can respond by building these monumental museums, or we can respond by trying to find different ways to touch each other. And I think that that prayer for a totally secular person like me, who has a very negative relationship to Christianity, touched me profoundly. So there are small ways in which that can happen.
Okay, I knocked myself out reading that, and it's a really weird experience as a writer to spend a lot of time writing something, and you don't actually realize what it is until you read it out loud in public for the first time, and that was very tough. And so I feel like my abstract thinking capacity is a little bit like not working right now. So anyways, that was what I was going to say.
Okay, so just a couple of things come up for me. One is that I think that a lot of what we're seeing is about questions of visibility and invisibility, kind of old-fashioned concepts that are often sort of perceived to be, no longer viable, but of course remain incredibly important. When we're talking about the rendering visible of acts of violence, or the rendering visible of sites of detention and shadow prisons and other things. And I think part of what we see here is all of the ways in which spaces can be flexible and repurposed. And I think maybe to think about, flexibility versus limitation, right? So yes, stadiums get repurposed into torture centers, churches get repurposed, right, as forms of erasure. But then sites can also be repurposed back, that detention centers then get repurposed back into nonprofits in Argentina that are working in the neighborhood, that kind of thing. But I also think then there are limitations, right? There are limitations to how you might repurpose a skyscraper, for instance, like One World Trade Center. And there are limitations that come from that question of site specificity, right? So a site like Ground Zero, through its specificity and the way in which that specificity has been inscribed, is an incredibly difficult site to think of in flexible terms and to open up from. And the last thing I want to say about kitsch, because one of my feelings about kitsch is that it is not flexible. There are forms of kitsch that are. The American version happens to be less so, right? And I think it is very much about prescribed emotion. There's a limited number of practices that extend outward from a teddy bear that says FDNY on it, right?
Fire Department of New York.
I mean, maybe some of us can do something ironic with it, but in general, those are limited. And I would just like to note that the madres in Argentina have souvenirs, right? I'm assuming it doesn't happen here, right? But they are now at a stage in their, at a moment when they are not adversaries of the government, before which they march every week. They sell tchotchkes and souvenirs. And so, and I think that raises really, really complicated questions about politics and affect and consumerism. Maybe I'll end there.
Of course, things can have memories too. When you were reading your poem, Nancy, I thought about that chandelier, what it was hiding, what it meant for the person who owned it, the invaluable chandelier was hiding so much about the genocide and revealing so much about it. And that was the man as conscious of it. What kind of consciousness did he have of that history? It became sort of a symbolic.
Well, we even asked, why did you still call it the Five Brothers, right?
Uh-huh.
When they rebuilt the apartment buildings, and said, well, that's how everybody knew it here, and we've had to keep the name so people would know what we were talking about. But it's like, what do they know that they're talking about? Who are the Five Brothers?
Yeah, it's about erasing, erosion.
But haunting, like that virgin that keeps coming up through the wall in the mosque.
Absolutely.
That they had to now put a board
it back,
over and nail it down.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so I think we're 5 minutes late, and we might ask, I shall ask Ayşegül to take the mic and close of our session with Ayşegül.
Comment, a short one-question comment to two of the presenters, but I can say it later on too if you want. We are too late.
Maybe just the comment. I don't think we have time for questions.
Okay. I just was wondering the expression being witnesses of the witnesses by Professor Sirman. A question about positionality and the relation of knowledge production. We were all in Istanbul, and we were also reading newspapers. Those of us who read Özgür Gündem. Do we really have that kind of distance? And questions about what makes knowledge production now possible, not possible at that time, when extrajudicial killings and disappearances were taking place. Were we really we as academics have that kind of distance to our societies when all these crimes were unfolding before us?
We are probably left with lots of questions ourselves, but that's probably a good thing that you have inspired us to ask new questions and in new ways. Before we end, we would like to make an announcement that relates very much to this panel, but we will do that in Turkish, so those of you who need headphones might want to put them on. Cumartesi anneleri neredeyse 500 haftadır toplanıyorlar. Bugün tam da onların bu ısrarlı buluşmalarının, ısrarlı tanıklıklarının belki bizim tarihimizde gördüğümüz en uzun süreli siyasal eylem ve tanıklık biçimi. Onların bizler ne kadar tanıkları olabiliyoruz? 500. haftalarına özellikle davet ediyorlar hepimizi ama her cumartesi için genel bir davetleri var. Bu kağıt hemen merdivenin orada duruyor, alabilirsiniz. Yanında Aylin Tekiner var. Eğer yukarıda sergiyi gördüyseniz Aylin Tekiner bu sergi için çok çarpıcı bir iş yaptı. Meydanlarda kaldırılan fotoğraflar eve gittikleri zaman nerelere konuyorlar, evlerdeki yas duvarları nasıl oluşuyor ve bize ne söylüyorlar, nasıl konuşuyorlar. Onu hem fotoğrafladı hem de kayıp yakınlarının seslerini bize taşıdı. Çok etkileyici bir iş. 400. haftasında Cumartesi annelerinin Aylin Tekiner'in yaptığı başka bir iş vardı. Beni her duyduğumda ve her üzerine düşündüğümde çok etkiliyor. Tam da mekanlardan bahsederken, mekanların hafızasından, objelerin, nesnelerin hafızasından bahsederken çok çarpıcı bir iş. Beyoğlu civarında duvarlara farklı yazmalar, başörtüleri takarak altlarına
iki sözü iliştirmiş. Cumartesi ailelerinin ifadeleri bunlar. Döneceğine inanmak zorundayım, ben hep buradayım. Onlar hep orada, biz de orada olalım onların yanında. Özellikle 500. haftada diye Aylin Tekiner'e söz veriyorum.
Evet, 25 Ekim 2014'te Cumartesi günü yine saat 12'de Galatasaray Meydanı'nda olacak Cumartesi anneleri, Cumartesi insanları. Devlet şiddetinin, faili meçhul cinayetlerin, zoraki kaybetmelerin altındaki mekanizmaya çomak sokmadığımız sürece Türkiye'de bir demokratikleşme sürecinden söz edemeyeceğiz ve çok uzun süre bunun özlemiyle yaşamaya devam edeceğiz. Bu sebeple Cumartesi anneleri 25 Ekim Cumartesi saat 12'de karanfillerinizle beraber onların yanında olmaya sizi davet ediyorlar. Biz orada olacağız, siz de umarım orada olursunuz.
Bitirmeden önce bu olağanüstü bir güne, toplantıya katkıda bulunan herkese teşekkür etmek istiyoruz. En başta size gerçekten çok yoğun bir gündü. Bu sergiyi ve de arkasındaki buluşmayı mümkün kılan Kolombiya Üniversitesi, özellikle Sosyal Farklar Araştırma Merkezi'ne, Depo'ya, Anadolu Kültür'e, Hafıza Merkezi'ne, Sabancı Üniversitesi Toplumsal Cinsiyet ve Kadın Çalışmaları Forumu'na, destekleri için New York Üniversitesi Hemispheric Institute, Diana Taylor'a, Blinken Enstitüsü'ne ve Sabancı Üniversitesi'ne maddi destekleri için özellikle çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Son bir şey daha söyleyecektim ama unuttum. Tamamen bende de bütün günün yorgunluğu. Hepiniz burada olduğunuz için sağ olun. Friedrich Ebert Vakfı, tam onu düşünüyordum. Friedrich Ebert Vakfı bugünkü buluşmamızın iki dilli olmasına ve birbirimize ulaşmasına imkan tanıdı. Çevirmenlerimize bütün bir gün bizimle birlikte oldukları için ve destekleri için Friedrich Ebert Vakfı'na çok çok teşekkür ediyoruz.